me today in the Capital TV show, Len Khodorkovsky. He's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Senior Advisor to US Envoy for Iran. Len Khodorkovsky served also as a Chief Marketing Officer of America's Economic Diplomacy. You are most welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Mr. Khodorkovsky, Minister Zarif reports that the Biden administration so far has agreed to lift almost all sanctions, including all sectoral sanctions, IRGC, FTO, Supreme Leader's Office. According to Zarif, all banks, including CBI, will be removed from the sanction list except one. What is this winning for Iran's regime? And it's a lose for the American administration, don't you think so?
Yes, I do. Well, let's take it back a little bit. Number one, let's look at the source. Zarif and the Foreign Ministry are not exactly the most credible source, so I prefer to wait and see what the actual details are. The reports coming out of Vienna have not been encouraging, so there is a reason to believe that the Biden administration is going above and beyond what they originally said that they would do, which was compliance for compliance. The original terms where Iran goes back in the deal, and then the Biden administration goes back in the deal. We're way past that point, it seems, at this juncture. And not only is the Biden administration now going to seemingly remove all nuclear-related sanctions, which is part of their JCPOA agreement, but it seems they're going above and beyond that to include terrorist-related sanctions, oil-related sanctions, things that even the Obama administration said they would not go beyond. So certainly the reports out of Vienna are troubling. I would not be surprised if the Biden administration gave away the store in their desperation to go back into the deal. But let's wait and see. I wouldn't necessarily trust Zarif to know the details on what's going to happen.
But you said also you don't trust the whole regime, not only Zarif. It's not a trust regime.
Well, yeah, certainly I wouldn't trust the propaganda of the regime, whether it's Zarif or some other source. But look, I mean, let's be honest. The reports coming out of Vienna have not been encouraging when it comes to the United States national security. It seems that the Biden administration is hell-bent on giving away, conceding all the leverage they've attained from the last 4 years of maximum pressure. So, yeah, I would not be surprised if a lot of the sanctions that were not supposed to be lifted will be lifted, and that would be a bad thing for American national security.
You said the Biden-Iran policy is incoherent. On one hand, it's striking Iran-backed terror groups. On the other, it wants to send billions to Iran, which will flow back to the same terror groups. Is it a contradiction here?
Of course it is. It's incoherent, their policy. And I mean, look at it on its face. It's plain for everybody to see. We are seeing greater and greater attacks on American interests, on American troops, our employees, our interests, our facilities in the region, both from the Iraqi Shia militias and others. So far, the Biden administration has retaliated very modestly on a warehouse somewhere, on the Syrian-Iraqi border. I don't think that's going to be an effective deterrent. And the more that Iran sees the Biden administration be very weak in responding, the more likely they're to keep directing their proxies in Iraq and elsewhere to attack American interests. And so if there's no reason for them to stop, they'll just keep doing it because they see a benefit in doing that and getting more and more concessions. So that's very dangerous for us.
You said Iranian opposition, they asked Naftali Bennett, we await the day when Iran and Israel, under the auspice of the Cyrus Accords, establish serious political, cultural, economic, and technological relations. And we believe that this day is closer than ever. On which opposition you're talking about? Which opposition? Do you think the opposition in Iran is united, or there is many sectors?
Well, look, traditionally there have been a number of factions in Iran that oppose the regime. That's still true. There are a number of different factions, but more and more the opposition to the regime is growing, and it's looking past their own internal differences and toward their common enemy, which is the regime that's been oppressing them for 42 years.
Mhm.
So, and I think the process of uniting has probably started around the time of the 2019 protests, where 1,500 Iranians were massacred by the regime. And people are basically seeing that the regime does not represent them. They've known that for a long time, but I think it's made it plain and clear that that's the case. The regime has lost all legitimacy in the people's eyes. You saw that in the presidential elections recently, where the turnout was, I think, probably the lowest in history. And again, I'm skeptical when it comes to the regime numbers about the turnout. They said it was 48%. I would be surprised if it were anything over 40, probably less than 40. So you're seeing the Iranian people unite around the idea that the regime no longer can deliver on their basic needs. All the promises that Ayatollah Khamenei promised in 1979 have not come true. They're seeing corruption. They're seeing incompetence. They're also seeing their money flow to Assad and the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah and everyone else other than the people's needs. And I think that the vision that you mentioned of future Cyrus Accords, which is something that my colleague Victoria Coates and I wrote about, which is a concept that will follow on the Abraham Accords, but except it'll be a future peace deal between Israel and Iran.
What is the concept of Cyrus Accords?
Well, the concept is historical. It's the Cyrus Accords are named after Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great is an ancient Persian leader who ruled about 2,500 years ago and was known for his tolerance and openness. He happened to have liberated the Jewish people from Babylonia, which is Iraq in the current day, and allowed them to practice their religion and allowed them to go back to what is now Israel, that was previously a Jewish state, and build their temple. So there is a long history of Jews and Persians, Iranians and Israelis finding common ground and being able to find relationships and collaborate in meaningful ways. And the last 42 years of the Islamic Revolution is an aberration. It is not the norm in history. So what we proposed is that somewhere down the road,
Len, I want to ask you a question. Maybe it's out of the order. Do you believe in a country that can be built on a sect or on a belief like the Jews country or something like this?
Well, so I think it depends is the answer. The Jewish state of Israel is based on its historical presence on that piece of real estate. If you go back to King David, who established the old Jewish state of Judea and established the capital of Jerusalem as the capital of that state, that goes back 3,500 years. So when you're talking about, is there a place for a state based on a sect or religion? Yes. In this case, it happens to be that in that land, the Jews have lived for 3,500 years, going back to King David. And other countries are composed differently. They're composed with different nationalities that may not work the same way. But in the case of Israel, it does work that way.
With lots of diversity inside the country, maybe in the future.
Certainly. I mean, however the state is composed, the American perspective is it should be based on what the people are expecting. The people should determine their own destiny. So whether it's 3 tribes, 20 tribes, or 1 tribe, the people have to decide how to govern themselves, not the government deciding how to govern them and imposing dictatorships on them.
Based on democracy and human values, as I said.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go back to Ibrahim Raisi, the butcher. The UN are investigating him, and do you think that the sanctions or this investigation um, for his involved in massacres of 1988 will lead to somewhere?
I don't have much faith in the UN when it comes to holding dictators accountable. Unfortunately, the United Nations is full of unsavory and dictators who have disdain for human rights. In fact, you'll notice that a number of these countries are part of the UN Human Rights Council, which the United States and the Trump administration left because of that, because it's a joke. You're going to have Venezuela and Syria and Libya and some other countries that are that have no respect for human rights dictate to democracies how to behave in that realm. So yeah, I'm not confident the UN will hold them responsible. Perhaps there'll be a report issued that will confirm what everybody knows. But at the same time, I think it's going to be very uncomfortable for countries outside of Iran that have to deal with the butcher to sit in the same room with him and give, from the United States perspective, give away money to the butcher.
Yeah, does this affect the negotiation in Vienna?
It should, but apparently it doesn't. It should affect it. I believe the State Department spokesman said regardless of who the president of Iran is, the negotiations are going to continue. And of course,
maybe
everything should change.
Because the role of the president is not so effective as much as Ayatollah Khamenei. So he is the leader. So it doesn't matter. The whole regime is terrorist.
That's true.
Regime, yeah.
That's true. The Ayatollah Khamenei does call the shots. However, the president does have some power. The president, has some legislative influence, and beyond the actual power, it's the optics of it. It's on one hand, the Biden administration is saying that human rights are at the core of their foreign policy. On the other hand, they're going to give away billions and billions of dollars to the butcher of Tehran. And as I said, that's incoherent.
It will go to the terrorist militia. A question was raised, how can we restore the deterrence code with Iran and stop their attacks in the Middle East? And maybe that affects America's interests also.
Well, of course it does. So the way the Trump administration tried to enforce deterrence is the logical way, I think. You can look at the elimination of Qasem Soleimani, that's deterrence. You can look at putting maximum pressure on the world's top state sponsor of terrorism, that's deterrence. You can look at the coalition that we assembled to prevent Iranian Navy from pirating ships in the Straits of Hormuz, that's deterrence too. So, and I would add one more. The Biden administration can walk away from negotiations. That would be deterrence, because the regime only wants the money that will come out of the negotiations. And if they see that they have no chance of getting that money, they will respond in changing their behavior. So there are things that the Biden administration can do, is just choosing not to do them.
Let's go back or go further to another subject. Biden is under pressure to respond to escalating attacks on US troops in Iraq and Syria. And there is a confrontation between US and pro-Iranian groups in Syria. And that will pose challenges for Russia. So how do you see, or what is your approach about this subject?
Let's look at this again from the perspective of American national security. Obviously, we have interests in Iraq. We've spent the last 20 years in Iraq. We've invested in a brighter future for the Iraqi people. We've invested in a democratic government in a way that is responsive to the needs of the Iraqi people. We're also aware that Iran wants to sabotage that. Iran wants to exert influence in Iraq, and it's trying to get the American presence out of Iraq, just like America has left Afghanistan. So we have a distinct national security interest. The way we've approached dealing with this issue in the Trump administration is to say to the Iranian regime that if our troops are attacked, if our facilities are attacked, it won't matter whether it comes from the Shia proxies in Iraq. We're going to hold you directly responsible. And yes, we can keep going back and forth with all of these pinpoint attacks from the proxies, but it all goes back to Tehran. And unless the Biden administration holds Tehran accountable, we can foresee more and more of that endangering and possibly killing more Americans.
This is a critical situation. What do you think would be the role of Iran in Afghanistan, especially that Iran shares US withdrawal from Afghanistan, but fears what could follow as Western forces exit Afghanistan? Iran is watching with alarm. What is the next prediction for the role of Iran in Afghanistan?
Well, Afghanistan has been a complicated issue for a long time. Certainly, the Soviet troops that invaded Afghanistan had a lot of problems there. You know the history of the American presence in Afghanistan going back to 9/11, where we invaded Afghanistan to get rid of Al Qaeda, and we've been there for 20 years up until now. So the United States has been in Afghanistan for a long time, and it's a problematic space. It's not just a problem for us, it's a problem for Russia, and it's a problem for Iran. And so the question is, whatever presence Iran is going to have in Afghanistan, and the Quds Force has been there on and off for a while, just like they've been in the rest of the region, destabilizing the country. It's certainly not in America's interest, Afghani interest, or the interest of the region to have a stronger Iranian presence in Afghanistan or anywhere else outside of Iran. We certainly won't have as much leverage to push back on Iran in Afghanistan, but I think Iran is weary on getting too deep into that particular country, because it's seen what happens to foreign forces that end up trying to stay in Afghanistan for a long time. And at the same time, look, I mean, let's go back to maximum pressure. The idea behind that is that it will deny the regime money. And the less money the regime has, the fewer places it can cause trouble. That includes Afghanistan, that includes Iraq, that includes Syria, that includes the rest of the region. Yeah. And so the maximum pressure isn't just a tactic to help the United States secure its national security. It's a tactic to help Iran's neighbors protect themselves from Iranian meddling.
And to stop her terror organization. On the relation with Russia, Biden urges Putin to stop ransomware attacks against US. And he said so at the summit also, but the summit was between the two countries. He again warned Mr. Putin that the US is prepared to retaliate. How it can happen, this retaliation?
Well, again, the United States does have ways that it can push back on malign regimes. So, I mean, you saw some things back in the Trump administration that we've done. We can certainly sanction entities. We can expel diplomats like we did during the Trump administration. We can put something like global Magnitsky sanctions on individuals. So there are ways that we can retaliate, and those are the overt ways. There are plenty of covert ways to retaliate as well. And, cyber warfare is not something that only Russia is skilled at. That is an option that exists for the United States as well. So there are ways that we can retaliate beyond just kinetic retaliation. But at the same time, I don't think President Putin is shaking in his boots at threats from President Biden, because this administration has exuded weakness, and I don't think that President Putin is going to be nervous about doing bad things because President Biden told them not to do them.
Mm-hmm.
So it just like with every other malign actor, it takes a credible deterrence, and the Biden administration is going to have to work at building its credibility in that sector.
My last question about your opinion on Abraham Accords, that was signed between UAE and Israel. And did you hear about giving the nationality UAE passport for 5,000 Israeli citizen? Do you know anything about it?
I haven't heard about the passport issue, but in general, I think the Abraham Accords are a game changer for the region. I'm proud that our administration was able to change the paradigm when it comes to negotiating peace in the region. For a long time, the common wisdom was that the road to peace in the Middle East leads through Israeli-Palestinian peace accord. What the Abraham Accords have shown is that the Arab countries have their own needs. They would like to improve their economy. They would like to improve the lives of their people. In the case of the Emirates, they're now flying into space. They're holding a world fair. And all of the countries are seeing benefits from interacting and building relationships both with Israel and the United States. Mm-hmm. And so I think from that respect, it's changed the way people are looking at trying to build peace and prosperity in what used to be, not long ago, the world's most dangerous neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And the more countries enter into things like the Abraham Accords, the more likely that the region is going to turn the corner and start a new chapter toward growth and innovation. There's so many young people in the region. Yeah. There's so much potential. And I think Israel plays a big part in that because they're a startup nation. They certainly have technological know-how. In the case of Iran, for example, they could help Iran with their water needs. There's a drought in Iran. Yeah, Israel is at the forefront of water technology. Mm. And so there are many ways that countries in the neighborhood can collaborate, and Abraham Accords is paving the way. And I hope, as you mentioned before, that after the era of the Abraham Accords, the era of Cyrus Accords will usher in a peace agreement between the people of Israel and the people of Iran.
Len Khodorkovsky, I thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.